Story 1. In September of 2024, a lost land was discovered. We shouldn't have opened its doors. The city of Provecta was designed between 1829 and 1856. Its engineers, who were like wizards of their time, worked secretly. They wanted to protect their advanced inventions from other countries and also to hide from the church and government, which might oppose their futuristic research. While the rest of the world was just getting used to simple electric lights, Provecta had magical machines. They had water treatment systems, farms that grew plants without soil, and endless energy. It was a city built underground, designed to survive if the world above did not. People were afraid of war, famine, and society collapsing. Provecta wasn't meant to save all of mankind. It was built for those who wanted to escape from mankind. In 1857, about 6,000 people went underground, and the doors were sealed. Only a few people knew about it, and it was kept as a secret by the government. "I don't like him," Georgina Pendle whispered as we walked through the forest, her voice barely heard over the sound of our footsteps. "Well, don't let him know that," I told her, looking nervously at Dr. Thomas Gregson, who was ahead of us. Our research team was approaching a newly discovered site. Historians had been searching for this city for decades. I couldn't believe it until I saw it myself. In the middle of a forest clearing, there were 2 steel doors hidden under moss, dirt, and fallen leaves. The doors had been opened by a team that arrived before us. Dr. Gregson, the leader of our expedition, was very angry. "Why?" he asked in a calm but firm voice. A man in a bright jacket shrugged. "Director Blum said—" "I was in the meeting with Director Blum," Gregson interrupted, louder. "The doors were supposed to be opened under my supervision. It was clearly specified." "With all due respect, Gregson," the man in the jacket said with his hands on his hips, "I don't work for your agency. Besides, you were late, and we were supposed to start at noon. We started at 10 past. If we delayed any longer, we would have faced consequences." Dr. Gregson scoffed. "Think critically, Mr. Hanley." "There were issues with my transportation. You were informed and should have waited." Hanley, the man in the jacket, just shrugged again. He was the only one who wasn't fazed by Gregson. Hanley and his team of laborers didn't understand the importance of Dr. Gregson's work, but I did, so I kept quiet. Frustrated by Hanley's lack of response, Gregson barked, "You don't get it, do you? The site was disturbed an hour ago. Your team was just sitting here, doing nothing. Exposure to the elements might have damaged artifacts. Might have. I doubted that an hour of fresh air would cause any problems. I also knew that Gregson knew this, which meant he was lying. It meant something else about Hanley's early start bothered him. Through the open doors, a staircase disappeared into the darkness below. Even with our flashlights, we couldn't see the bottom. I was glad Hanley and his team went first because those old steel steps made my teeth chatter. We went down 300 meters, our footsteps echoing loudly. 2,000 steps, which were surprisingly intact. My step tracker was about to notify me that I had hit my daily goal. When the first laborer reached the bottom, their flashlights revealed a tunnel ahead. The tunnel was as wide as the staircase and as long as our flashlight beams. At the end of the tunnel was a single wooden door, which looked perfectly preserved. We eagerly moved towards it, and any arguments stopped. Even the laborers, who didn't know much about the project, were excited. The reality hit us. The city was real. On a small stone slab beside the door, it read, "Provecta." That was all. No other details, no warnings. The door wasn't even locked, which made Dr. Gregson happy and the rest of us uneasy. I told myself the steel doors above were the real barriers, and a simple wooden door wouldn't need to be secure. But when the door creaked open, the sound echoed through the tunnel and into the vast space beyond, the city of Provecta. As we entered, our flashlights revealed a wasteland of buildings and a cobblestone street ahead. A rusty signpost read, "Main Street." On either side of the road were the remains of 2-story homes, burnt and hollow structures, stone walls with all wooden parts gone. It told a dreadful story from the past. But what made us gasp was the distant lights. Yellow specks in the city center. The inner city had some lights, while the outer city was in darkness. "Life," Dr. Sally Ware whispered in awe. "The lights outlasted life," Georgina said, shattering Dr. Ware's dream. "The machines were built to last. That's all. Dr. Ware." "And that's the main reason for this project," Dr. Gregson said. "Mr. Broughton's source of infinite power should not stay hidden. Director Blom ordered us to take it back with us. Tall buildings stood in the city centre, their windows still lit. They were so tall that their tops were near the reinforced concrete ceiling of Prevecta. It was one of the largest concrete structures on Earth, an incredible feat for the time it was built. It made me uneasy. "We don't know if the city is empty," I said quietly. I was sure not all the sounds came from us. Some noises came from deep within the city. As much as I wanted to believe it was just buildings settling or old machinery, I felt there was life in those distant sounds. Dr. Gregson shone his flashlight at me, still walking. "Mr. Walter, I hired you and Mrs. Pendle as engineers, not historians." I was about to respond when a labourer's flashlight caught a stone wall ahead. This wall separated the dark outskirts from the somewhat lit centre, the only life left in Prevecta. The wall had a 6 feet tall barrier with a wooden platform. A steel plaque on the wall read, "No men." One of the labourers was lifted by 2 others, and she pulled a ladder down from the platform. A few minutes later, we all climbed over the wall and saw the city centre more clearly. Main Street continued for another quarter-mile before reaching a large T-junction with tall towers on the other side. Patchy light came from windows and lampposts, though most of the city was still dark. But it was something. It showed that this city was once a futuristic place, full of life, hidden beneath a world that struggled to catch up. Georgina's scream made us all stop. Flashlights pointed at her, highlighting her shaky hand as she pointed to a second-floor window 50 yards ahead. "What?" I asked, putting a hand on her shoulder. She tensed up and whimpered. There was a woman. Dr. Gregson raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" "In the window," she croaked as we all looked at the glass pane. "I saw someone watching us." "It's dark, and the light is playing tricks on you," Gregson said sharply, mumbling about incompetence and continuing to walk. There were murmurs of uncertainty from the team, but everyone followed the project leader. We passed 2 century-old buildings, some lit, some not, on our way to the tallest tower. I was so close to finding the right words to calm my anxious co-worker, but I bit my tongue and tasted blood, wincing in pain. I saw a black shape move across the road ahead. "What was that?" Dr. Ware screamed, jumping back with several workers. "That wasn't just a shadow," a worker cried, turning around. Then that same man screamed loudly. Most of us turned around and joined him in crying out. Shapes were slowly moving from the stone wall towards us, blocking our exit. They were figures in black cotton robes. Under one of the black hoods, our flashlight beams revealed a face that looked almost human, but was horribly disfigured. It had wide nostrils and lips that were too big. Dr. Gregson didn't give any orders. Chaos took over as our team members ran in all directions. Georgina Pendle and I followed Dr. Gregson's small group forward since there were no figures ahead. As we ran up Main Street towards the tall building, we heard screams from our fleeing colleagues. I screamed too, thinking about what might have happened to those behind us. But I knew when the screams started to fade and were replaced by crunching and splattering sounds that no one had escaped. When our group of survivors finally reached the high-rise building, 2 workers burst through the entrance, which had once had wooden doors that had rotted away. The lobby was lit by oval-shaped bulbs hanging from the wooden ceiling. A stone sign on the wall read, "Prevecta's Institution of Research." Dr. Gregson didn't let us stay in the lobby. He seemed to know the building's layout and led us to a hallway on the right side of the lobby. It led into the heart of the research center. I turned one last time before we disappeared into the corridor and looked out of the building's entrance. I saw shapes of various colors on the cobblestones of Main Street behind us. Some were twitching, others were still. All were covered in red. Dr. Gregson led us through a side door to a staircase, and we began to climb. As we went up, we heard muffled thuds from within the building, a sign that we were not alone. "I'm going to make a call," Mr. Hanley said as we reached the 4th floor. "Here!" Dr. Gregson cried triumphantly, barging through another empty doorway. "Dr. Gregson," I began, following him as he picked up a remarkably well-preserved book from a dusty desk. "This is only a couple of decades old," he whispered, stroking the leather cover lovingly. "Do you understand? It was printed recently, Dr. Wade. They must have continually revisited and reprinted Mr. Broughton's original work. New historians, engineers, and scientists. That means those figures on Main Street. They were people." "No signal," Mr. Hanley interrupted, waving his satellite phone angrily as footsteps sounded along both sides of the corridor. "We're on our own. Gregson, and everyone knows it. They're scattering. Is there another way out of here? Away from Main Street, I mean." Dr. Gregson ignored him, smiling as he flipped through the book's pages. "This is everything. Everything we need." Hanley, Georgina, and I gathered in the small room, a neglected, wooden-walled office that hadn't been touched in years. We stood behind Dr. Gregson, who clutched the book tightly to his chest and stared out of the window at the dark city beyond and its concrete sky overhead. We saw occasional shadows flitting across alleys in the distance. "So much life," Gregson whispered hungrily. "Listen," Hanley said, stepping forward and putting a hand on his shoulder. "We're not going that way. Show us another way out of here. Now." Dr. Gregson shrugged him off and spun around. "We must get this book out of here." "We must get us out of here," Hanley insisted, but he nodded as Gregson pushed past, leading the four of us out of the small office. Someone was about to say something, telling Dr. Gregson to get a hold of himself, but a slight creak made all of us turn our heads and flashlights to the left. My heart stopped when I saw only an empty hallway, but then the edge of my flashlight beam bulged inward. Something cut into the light from above. When I fearfully lifted my light upwards, it revealed twitching legs dangling from the ceiling. The blood-stained body of Dr. Wade was slipping through an open panel in the ceiling. But what made me scream until my lungs hurt were those horrible green eyes, watching me from the dark hole above, watching as it dragged the limp, bloody body out of sight. "Help!" she gurgled through blood. What haunted me most about that creature was its slowness. It had nothing to fear, no need to pull its prey quickly away, as it knew we would not stop it. I whined in terror as Wade gasped pleas to the four of us as she disappeared into the blackness. Then the green eyes vanished into the dark, and a wooden panel scraped across to fill the hole. "We need to leave," Dr. Gregson finally admitted, tossing the book to me. "That'll fit in your rucksack, won't it, Mr. Walter?" Georgina blubbered, eyes darting around. "They're everywhere!" Then, like a church mouse, Gregson began to run back towards the staircase, and the rest of us followed. We ran down the stairs and into the lobby, where we found a haunting row of black hoods outside the building blocking the exit. They did not chase us. They were calm and collected, like the creature in the ceiling, which unsettled me greatly. Gregson then led us down the corridor to the back of the building. We found ourselves following a twisting and turning route of alleyways, a cobblestone maze that felt disturbingly small and out of place in such a grand city centre. What truly made those winding alleyways disturbing was the sudden quietness of the city. No more distant thuds and clangs. I preferred knowing that the horrors were far away. We found our way to a dimly lit side road, away from Main Street, and ran towards another segment of the stone wall, a barrier that formed an unbroken circle around the illuminated heart of the city, separating Mr. Broughton's new society from the old world of men. "Oh no," Georgina whimpered as the three of us started to climb over the stone barrier. I heard it too, skittering from all around, from rooftops and alleys, most unsettling, from the dark interiors of the charred buildings alongside that cobblestone street ahead. When we dropped back down to the road, finding ourselves on the other side, Dr. Thomas Gregson made the mistake of casting his flashlight up to the source of the noise, to the clattering roof tiles of a small house beside us. Atop those tiles was a man, well, a once man. I know no other way to describe it, even after seeing it in the harsh glare of our 3 flashlight beams. A man, with his dark hood lowered onto his back, had pale flesh covered in folds that made his skin look too loose for his frame, a frame that was still unimaginably bulky, and the man had double the limbs, 4 arms, 4 legs. Before I could process the existence of such a thing, it scuttled across the tiles on all 8s. Then it hissed and jumped off the roof's edge, plummeting towards Dr. Gregson's frozen form. But Mr. Hanley threw himself in the way, pushing Gregson behind him, and caught the full brunt of the creature's attack. The lead worker shrieked as the clawing began, as the once man tore into his victim's frail human body with 20 fingernails. Georgina and I, faces covered in tears and terror, turned away. We couldn't bear to see Mr. Hanley's fate, a man whose first name I never even learned. Then my colleague and I found the courage to flee rather than freeze. Dr. Thomas Gregson, however, did not follow. As my colleague and I ran down the side street, slipping through the darkness towards freedom, Georgina's flashlight clattered to the cobblestones, falling from her hand in our frantic escape. I was left to light the way with the sole remaining flashlight between us. But moments later, those 2 sets of footsteps became one. I knew I should keep moving forward, but I couldn't. When I turned to see Georgina standing still in the darkness, I was initially relieved to find her there, to find her simply quivering on the spot. "Come on," I urged, holding out my hand for her to take. But Georgina looked at me absently and very slowly shook her head before spluttering violently. Then came red droplets from both her twitching lips and the center of her white shirt. 20 fingers, sprouting from the darkness behind my dear friend, wrapped around her midsection. It was as if a crowd of people were clutching her body, but I knew that only one of those wretched things was behind her. One was enough. The appendages yanked Georgina Pendle back into the darkness, dragged her at unthinkable speed beyond the farthest reach of my flashlight beam. And I was alone. There came more skittering sounds, more shapes moving at the edges of my flashlight's glow, a glow that seemed to be shrinking, filling with the black shadows of those things moving towards me, encircling me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I realized I was surrounded. The black-robed figures were closing in, their disfigured faces and eerie movements sending chills down my spine. I knew I had to find a way out, and fast. With a burst of adrenaline, I sprinted towards the nearest gap between the figures, hoping to break through their encirclement. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed my legs to move faster, my flashlight bobbing wildly. I felt something brush against my arm, but I kept running, refusing to look back. I had to get to the steel doors. They were my only chance of escape. Just as I thought I was going to make it, one of the figures lunged at me, grabbing my leg. I stumbled and nearly fell, but managed to keep my balance. With a desperate kick, I freed myself from its grasp and continued running. The steel doors were getting closer. I could see the faint light from the forest outside. I pushed myself harder, my muscles screaming in protest. Finally, I reached the doors and burst through them, stumbling into the forest. I didn't stop running. I couldn't stop running. I needed to put as much distance between myself and Provector as possible. The cool night air hit my face, and the sounds of the forest filled my ears. Leaves crunched under my feet, and branches scratched at my skin. But I kept moving forward. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I found a small clearing and collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. My flashlight lay beside me, its beam illuminating the dark trees around me. For a moment I felt a sense of relief. I had escaped, but the horrors of Provector still haunted my mind. I knew I couldn't rest for long. I had to find help and warn the world about what lay beneath the forest floor. My journey was far from over, and the secrets of Provector weighed heavily on my mind. But for now, I was safe. At least, I hoped I was. He wanted to create a new kind of people. The political conditions were finally perfect. Fear ruled the minds of many citizens of Provector. Hundreds of people volunteered for Dr. Grant's experiments. They were changed genetically to survive on less food and oxygen. They were altered to see better in the dark, and to be stronger and faster. Mutations followed, of course, but Dr. Grant explained that this was expected. After all, they were no longer human. This started a war between the genetically altered people and those who refused to change. No men were allowed beyond the stone barrier built around the city center. All humans were pushed to the outskirts and were cut off from the main resources in the heart of the city. They had no power and no food. After this separation, violence broke out. Houses were burned, blood was spilled, the altered beings tore the humans apart. One of Dr. Grant's passages stands out. We must realize the dream of our forefathers. It is clear now that they wanted us to end what came before, end mankind. Dr. Grant's idea was to create a new kind of people, different from normal humans. The situation in the city had become tense, and fear was everywhere. Many people were scared and decided to join Dr. Grant's experiments. These people were changed in many ways. They could live with less food and oxygen, see in the dark, and were much stronger and faster. But these changes also led to some strange mutations. Dr. Grant said this was normal because they were no longer ordinary humans. This change caused a conflict between the altered people and those who did not want to change. A stone wall was built around the city center, and it was decided that no humans, no men, could go inside. All humans were forced to live on the outer edges of the city. They were cut off from the main resources like power and food. After this separation, violence started. Houses were burned down and blood was everywhere. The altered beings attacked and killed the humans. One of the important writings from Dr. Grant says, "We must achieve the dream of our ancestors. It is clear that they wanted us to end what came before. We need to end mankind." Dr. Grant's goal was to create a new race of people who were different from regular humans. The political conditions were finally just right for his plans. Many people in the city of Provecta were living in fear. Hundreds of them agreed to undergo Dr. Grant's experiments. These experiments genetically altered them so they could survive on less food and oxygen. They could see better in the dark and had enhanced strength and speed. As expected, these changes caused mutations. Dr. Grant reassured everyone that this was normal since they were no longer humans. This led to a war between the altered people and those who did not want to evolve. A stone wall was built around the city center with a sign that said, "No men," meaning no humans were allowed inside. All the remaining humans were pushed to the outskirts of the city, cut off from essential resources like power and food. As a result, violence broke out. Houses were burned down, and there was bloodshed. The altered beings mercilessly attacked and killed the humans. One of Dr. Grant's most notable writings states, "We must fulfill the vision of our ancestors. It is evident now that they wanted us to eliminate what existed before. We need to end mankind." Story 2. I was deployed with the Royal Marine Commandos during the Gulf War. I'll never forget my only combat mission. Who am I? Well, I could tell you the truth, but then you'd probably never get to read this story and I'd be dead within a week. So, for now, you can call me Corporal Dexter. I'll also be changing the names of the rest of my squad and anyone else to protect them as well. I joined Her Majesty's Navy in 1987 at the young age of 18. From the beginning, I knew exactly where I wanted to be. The Royal Marine Commandos, the elite force of the best the Royal Navy had to offer. I passed all the pre-selection tests and interviews without much fuss. The PRMC selection course also went fairly well. Then came the 32 weeks of actual training. It had its ups and downs, and I did doubt myself at times, but I managed to finish somewhere in the middle of my class. After training, I was stationed for about a year in Belfast, keeping the peace, as they say. That year felt like an eternity for me and the boys in my unit. Car bombings, snipers, ambushes. We were almost cheerful when we got back to the barracks one evening to find out there was trouble half the world away from Ireland. The British government agreed to join the Americans in their mission against the man with the beret and the moustache, and we were about to go play soldier in the big sandbox. We got the call about an hour later to pack all our gear and be ready to catch a flight to Saudi Arabia the next morning. I slept most of the way, but woke up in time to see the sunrise over the deserts of Arabia. Like most kids, I grew up with tales of this land and the riches, adventures, and terrors it had to offer, and I had a feeling I'd experience all three before the end of this mission for Queen and Country. As the airbase the coalition forces were using came into view over the horizon, someone turned up the volume to the old song "Horse with No Name" by America on the stereo in the Land Rover they stuffed into the cargo plane with us. We all had a chuckle and complimented the young private for his timing. Right as the landing gear touched down, shaking the cabin of the massive C-130 and jarring us all back to reality. We collected all our gear and started to file out of the back of the aircraft and into trucks that would take us to our assigned barracks. As I neared the rear door, one of the boys from my unit, let's call him Harris, spoke up. "So, do you fancy yourself part of the next Desert Rats? Or perhaps Lawrence of Arabia?" I laughed once to myself and then turned to him. "I fancy myself coming home alive." "Harris," Harris replied. "Oh, come on now. Where's your sense of adventure?" "It's still there, Harris. I just want to live to tell the stories myself." I laughed and grinned back at him. Harris was a young, conventionally handsome guy with brown hair. Average height, brown hair. The kind of guy you'd see on ads promoting the Royal Navy. We took our seats in the back of the trucks and headed towards the rows of freshly built barracks. The truck pulled up along the front of one of the barracks and went down the row, stopping at each building as names were called. 2 or 3 men got off at each building. "Just like the school bus back home," Harris muttered to me. "Except these bags weigh less than the ones we carried back then," I replied. Harris laughed in agreement. Soon, Harris and I were called, and we hopped out of the back of the truck in front of the sun-baked and sand-covered barracks. "And here we are," I said to Harris as we headed up to the front door. I opened the door to see 4 other men with the Royal Marines patch on their shoulders unpacking. "You boys with Arrow Squad?" I asked as they all turned to me and nodded in agreement. Arrow Squad was the call sign they gave us when we were called up to join the operation in the Middle East. Only Harris and I were kept together from our old unit in Belfast. I guess we should introduce ourselves then, the tall and muscular red-headed man standing to my right said. I'm Sergeant Royce. I've been assigned to be squad leader. Next, the thinner and shorter man with black hair in the back spoke up. I'm Corporal Mills, sharpshooter. He turned away again. Then the markedly younger blonde lad chimed in. I'm Private Lang. I'll be handling the comms for the squad. This is also my first deployment, as if we all couldn't tell. But I'm glad it's with you guys, he added, before turning with us to look toward the last of the men in the barracks. A short but stocky gent, lifting weights shirtless on his cot. The name's Lee, support gunner, so I'll be the one covering your asses for the next 6 months. He had a large scar just above his right shoulder blade. He had been through some serious stuff. Then the room turned to us as I gave the introduction for both Harris and myself. I'm Corporal Dexter. I'll be second in command to the sergeant, as well as acting as grenadier for the squad. And this here is Lance Corporal Harris. He'll be handling all things mechanical for the unit, as well as being the designated comedian. Oh, that'll be real helpful in a gunfight, Lee quipped. Hey now, Lee, we could all use a bit of humor here, Royce added. We got settled in and enjoyed our first and only quiet evening in Arabia until lights out at 10 p.m. Harris thought it would be hilarious to loosen some screws on Lee's cot while he was at supper. 5 out of the 6 men in the squad enjoyed the prank as Lee went rolling to the floor after his bed crumpled like cardboard under him. The 6th man in the squad, however, was not as amused and immediately identified Harris as the culprit. Lee picked up his entrenching tool and chased Harris out of the barracks, forcing him to climb a telephone pole to escape the wrath of the angry support gunner. The next couple of weeks consisted of a steady regimen of PT training and squad tactics as we worked to be ready for deployment when it all kicked off. We were really coming together to my surprise. Royce could think on his feet and had a knack for improvisation. Lang could stay cool and deliver clear messages on the radio, even under the stress of explosions, enemy fire, and Harris and Lee cursing at each other at the top of their lungs. Mills could take the helmet off a mannequin target at 100 meters with nothing but an iron-sighted SA-80. And Lee could send a stream of bullets flying into an area as small or large as you like. Of course, Harris and I hadn't gotten rusty at all. I hit the turret of every scrap tank on the AT weapons range, and Harris kept all our weapons and equipment in top shape, as well as rigging us up a homemade FM radio so we could listen to the top 40 countdown the Americans got to enjoy on the other side of the base. On the last day of training before orders came down to us, something truly shocking happened. It was during a live fire exercise in the kill house. A maze filled with targets laid out like the interior of a building to simulate close-quarters battle scenarios. We breached the front door of the building and cleared the first room together, 4 hostile targets down. We were clearing rooms one after another down a long, straight hallway. Now to emphasize how important speed is when engaging a target. Some of the targets were rigged with paintball guns. They would activate and fire back at you via remote control if the officers in charge of that training session felt you weren't quick enough. We cleared the first 3 out of 5 rooms in the hallway without a problem. However, Harris and Lee decided it was a fine time to start their daily squabble as we were getting ready to breach room number 4. Harris, just stay behind me. Darling, Daddy's got this handled. Lee, why don't you go mind your own business, pretty boy, and let the men take care of this? Royce snapped around, furious. You two knock it off, he said in the most aggressive whisper you could imagine. The two went quiet again, but the challenge had been set on who was the better soldier in close-quarters combat. So far, Harris had eliminated 3 targets to Lee's 1. Royce kicked in the door and charged in. The proper way to enter the room is to go in single file as quickly as possible to cover your part of the room. Well, Lee and Harris were not going to let the other get ahead, so they went in at the same time and got stuck in the door frame, causing them both to stumble through the door and miss their targets. Me and Lang had to cover their areas as well as our own. A voice echoed on the intercom. Arrow Squad, you fumbled that breach and failed to follow proper safety protocols. One more mistake like that and I will inform your commander. Harris and Lee shot curses at each other under their breath as we regrouped and got ready for the final breach in this hallway. Same procedure as last time. Harris and Lee were to be the 3rd and 4th men through the door behind me and Royce. Breaching, breaching, breaching! I kicked in the door and went in, dropping 2 static targets and 1 paintball target before it could get a shot off. Royce took out 2 on the left, and Lee laid down a burst of bullets to take out the last 3 in the right corner. Lang, Mills and Harris had no targets in their sectors. Royce Lang, Mills, and I had filed back out of the room when it happened. "Now that's how it's done," smirked Lee at Harris. Harris let his inner prick out for a moment. "Yeah. Is that what you told your last squad before they got shot up?" Without a word, Lee suddenly charged Harris after he had turned to leave the room and shoved him to the ground so hard he slid at least 10 feet across the concrete floor. Harris rolled over as soon as he realized what happened and saw Lee towering over him. Just as he was about to leap back to his feet and go after Lee, 3 splashes of orange mist erupted from Lee's left shoulder, side, and hip. Harris paused and turned his head to see a hidden paintball target in the shadows of a closet. The target had activated and shot at Lee, marking him with the orange paint. The room fell silent as everyone processed what had just happened. Lee, realizing he had been hit, took a deep breath and stepped back from Harris. The tension in the room was thick. "All right, that's enough," Royce said firmly, stepping between the 2 men. "We need to work together, not against each other. This kind of behavior will get us all killed out there." Lee and Harris exchanged a look but said nothing. They both knew Royce was right. The incident served as a harsh reminder of the stakes they were facing. We continued our training with renewed focus, putting aside our differences. The incident in the kill house had shown us that we needed to rely on each other and trust one another, no matter what personal grudges we had. It was the only way we were going to survive our mission in the Gulf. And so, with our skills sharpened and our bonds strengthened, we prepared for the real thing. The call to action could come at any moment, and when it did, we would be ready to face the unknown, to protect our comrades, and to make it back home alive. "Don't just lie there, shoot it, you daft!" Lee yelled as Harris rolled onto his right side and double-tapped the target. We all ran back in to find the scene as the intercom echoed again. "Arrow Squad, you cleared the building but suffered a KIA. You failed this exercise, but because of the circumstances I've observed, I'm not recommending any disciplinary actions." I'm sorry," Harris said, looking at the floor as he got to his feet. Lee grumbled as he left to change out of his now stained uniform. "I messed up, didn't I, Dex?" Harris asked as he dusted himself off. "No more than usual. You 2 are going to have to knock this off, though, or we'll end up cleaning toilets for the next 6 months and never do our actual jobs again." "You think he likes Twinkies?" "What are you talking about, Jimmy?" "A peace offering. I'll fix his bed and give him the last box of Twinkies I took from that news crew when they were interviewing the commander." "That plan is ridiculous, but so are you." "Jimmy." "Too right, mate, too right." It turns out Lee did like Twinkies, and actually laughed at one of Harris's jokes while sitting on his now secure and freshly made cot. These parts are especially hard for me to write. As you can see, we were bonded as a team and friends. It was an extremely hot Monday morning when we got the call to be ready for deployment within 24 hours. We thought the whole force was about to deploy, and the liberation of Kuwait was about to begin. We spent all morning prepping and organizing our gear, as well as getting into the necessary headspace for real combat. There's always a possibility that one, a few, or all of us wouldn't make it back, but we were ready to do our best to prevent that. At about 1400 hours, we were called to meet with our commander for our first real mission brief. A lieutenant fresh out of training picked us up in a Land Rover and drove us across the base to an airplane hangar that was being used as a warehouse for equipment and weapons. We were ushered by the lieutenant through the building to a room near the rear, where 2 officers were waiting to give us our briefing and outline what our mission and duties would be in country. We had been selected to join the force to hunt down and destroy the chemical weapons Saddam had used on the Kurds back in '88, and was rumored to be preparing to use on the coalition forces in the event of an invasion of Kuwait. We took our seats, and the officer standing in the shadow of a projector stepped forward in front of us, a tall, thin man with grey hair and a thick, well-manicured moustache. "Gentlemen, my name is Colonel Starkey. You've been gathered here based on your exceptional skill sets to carry out a task of the utmost importance. The first slide, please, Captain." The colonel nodded to the young officer standing behind the projector. In that moment, the projector screen transitioned from a blank white screen to a satellite image of a well-fortified bunker standing alone in the barren desert. "This is the target of your mission." Satellite imaging located this bunker in the southern deserts of Iraq, approximately 20 miles from the Kuwaiti border. "Next slide, please." The projector then switched to a photo taken from the same angle, but after dark, showing trucks being unloaded into the large blast doors of the bunker. "We have significant intelligence leading us to believe these crates being unloaded are, in fact, Chemical munitions transported here for quick deployment in the event of a coalition invasion. The next slide, please, Captain Welsh. The screen switched to a profile picture of an Iraqi officer. This is General Amir Solomon of the Iraqi Republican Guard. He has been a key figure in the Iraqi chemical weapons program since the beginning. We also have good reason to believe he is on site at this facility currently. So now you know the facts. On to the plan. Gentlemen, the final slide, please. The officer brought up the final slide, showing again a bird's eye view of the bunker and the surroundings, but now from a much wider angle, showing the desert and some ancient ruins that surround the bunker. Colonel Starkey then drew a collapsible rod from his pocket and extended it before beginning to trace it along the slide. You'll be inserted here, approximately 3 kilometers south of the bunker via helicopter. From there, you'll proceed on foot to the target. Once reaching the target, you are authorized to make your way inside by any means necessary. Once there, you are to locate and destroy any chemical munitions you find, and conventional munitions as well if you find it convenient. You are also to locate and eliminate General Solomon with extreme prejudice. Finally, you are to gather any intelligence you can find, especially if it is found on or near General Solomon. Once your mission is completed, you may radio command back here at HQ using the code word Archangel. A chopper will return to the location of your insertion to pick you back up. The colonel took the rod and began to collapse it again in his hands. Now, any questions? Royce raised his hand and chimed in. Sir, what is the contingency plan in case the chemical weapons or the general aren't on site? The colonel smirked and replied, Then you are to eliminate all Republican Guard on site and destroy any valuable materials and equipment. Any intelligence you find is also to be secured and extracted with you at all costs. Royce nodded. Yes, sir. After Royce finished, I had a question of my own. Sir? I raised my hand. What weapons and equipment are we authorized for this operation? The colonel nodded. Right. You and your team are authorized to gather any weapons and equipment you deem necessary from the armory in this hangar. Be advised, though, this operation is just one of many being carried out at the moment, so it is first come, first serve. Yes, sir, I replied. Now hop to it, men. Our timetable is as limited as my own. We all got up and filed out to the armory. When we got there, we were somewhat underwhelmed by our selection. Thankfully, there was plenty of CRBN equipment and the related first aid for chemical weapon exposure. However, for weapons, we had a much more limited selection. The SAS had evidently gotten there before us, because all the non-standard weapons like M16s and MP5s had been taken along with all the suppressors. This left only the standard SA-80s and an L-86 LSW, which Lee snatched up along with a considerable amount of ammunition. We all grabbed a Browning high-power and holster off the rack as well. I, being the designated grenadier, grabbed as many rifle grenades as I could carry and stuffed them in my pack. The C4 used for demolition was split up between the team in case someone got hit. We each got 1 charge apiece to blow the chemical weapons and anything else that would need a quick and thorough removal. We got completely suited up and filed out of the barracks towards the waiting helicopter. The rotor wash stirred up a torrent of sand all around the landing pad, causing us to squint. We lifted off right at sunset, headed towards the border. As I sat in the open door, staring out at the dark orange setting sun casting shadows over the sea of sand, I started to get an eerie feeling, not just the pre-mission jitters to be expected though. It was more like that feeling of dread you get as a kid when you're forced to walk down a dark hallway to get to the light switch at the other end. That there's something out there in the desert tonight more dangerous than chemical weapons or elite Republican Guard. I put those thoughts to the back of my mind for the sake of my mates. About an hour later, we reached the LZ under the cover of darkness. The chopper sat down and let us off. We left the helicopter and fanned out in all directions to secure the LZ and make sure there were no scouting parties that could give away our presence. LZ clear, I said over the radio, letting the pilot know he was good to lift back off. All right, boys, let's get moving, Royce said, taking the lead. We then headed out, following the compass directions given to us back at base. We walked single file, each of us covering a section of the landscape, scanning the horizon for threats. This is already getting old, Harris quipped about 15 minutes into the trek. Better get used to it. This desert is our sandbox for the next year, I shot back. You getting the feeling we're strolling into the lion's teeth? Harris asked more seriously. Honestly, yeah. But we're Marine commandos. It's what we do, Jimmy. I cracked a smile at him to lighten the mood. Too right, mate, he chuckled back. That dreadful feeling hit me again as I watched the Commando Sea King helicopter disappear over the horizon. It was accompanied by the feeling of being watched, not by enemy scouts or snipers, but by something primal, supernatural. They say some people can sense when a spirit or ghost is in the room with them. Well, I never personally believed that, but that's the only way I could describe that particular feeling. We walked for about 45 minutes over a terrain of ridges and sand dunes until we reached the outside perimeter of the bunker. We knew we were close by the small piles of rubble and half-collapsed walls of the ancient village that once stood here. The remnants of the village gave the area an eerie, almost haunted feeling. "All right, let's spread out and find a way in," Royce whispered. We moved silently, each of us scanning the area for any signs of an entrance or guards. Harris and I carefully stepped over the uneven ground, our eyes constantly shifting from the ground to the surroundings. The moonlight cast long shadows, making every movement seem exaggerated and ominous. "There," Harris pointed towards what looked like a half-buried doorway in one of the ancient walls. We approached cautiously, weapons at the ready. Royce signaled for us to hold our positions as he inspected the entrance. "Looks clear," he said after a moment. "Let's move in, but stay sharp." One by one, we slipped through the narrow doorway and into a dark passageway. The air inside was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the hot desert outside. Our footsteps echoed softly as we advanced, the tension palpable. As we ventured deeper into the passage, it widened into a large chamber. The ceiling was high, supported by ancient stone pillars. In the center of the room, we could see a modern steel door, a stark contrast to the ancient surroundings. "That's our way in," Royce said, nodding towards the door. "Lee, get that door open. Everyone else, take positions and cover him." Lee moved quickly and efficiently, placing a small charge on the door's locking mechanism. We took up defensive positions around the room, our eyes scanning every shadow for potential threats. With a muffled explosion, the door's lock was blown open. Lee pushed the door aside, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. We moved forward, our senses on high alert. As we advanced through the bunker, the sense of unease grew stronger. The corridors were lined with crates and equipment, evidence of the activity that had taken place here. We reached a large storage room filled with barrels and canisters, marked with warning symbols. "These must be the chemical weapons," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Royce nodded. "All right, let's rig them with explosives and set the charges. We need to be quick and efficient." We worked swiftly, planting C4 charges on the barrels and canisters. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the sound of our movements. Once the charges were set, we moved on to the next objective. As we navigated the winding corridors, we finally reached the command center. The room was filled with maps, documents, and communication equipment, and there, in the center, stood General Amir Solomon, surrounded by a small group of guards. "Take them out quietly," Royce ordered. We spread out, taking positions around the room. In a synchronized move, we fired our silenced weapons, dropping the guards before they could react. General Solomon, realizing he was cornered, reached for a weapon, but it was too late. Royce's shot hit him squarely in the chest, and he fell to the ground. "Gather all the intelligence you can find," Royce instructed. We quickly collected documents, maps, and anything that looked important. Once we had everything, we made our way back through the bunker to the exit. As we reached the entrance, Royce radioed in the code word, "Archangel." The chopper was on its way. We hurried back to the extraction point, constantly looking over our shoulders. The sense of being watched never left us, but we kept moving. The helicopter's rotor blades were a welcome sound as we reached the LZ. We climbed aboard, the weight of our mission finally lifting as the chopper took off. As we flew back to base, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had haunted me throughout the mission. But we had succeeded. We had destroyed the chemical weapons and eliminated a key figure in the enemy's plans. For now, that was enough. We zigzagged around the ruins as we walked, and I started to notice there were a lot of writings on the walls that weren't in modern Arabic. They were probably from the time these buildings were first built. The ink they used was a deep red color, like scarlet, but aged for many centuries. I passed close to one of the particularly tall walls still standing, and as I did, the writing on the wall had a faint coppery smell. Surely not, I thought to myself. But then again, it wasn't uncommon for people to use animal blood as a form of spiritual protection back in those days. For example, the Book of Exodus mentions it. If it were blood, though, it would have to be hundreds of years old at least. There's no way it would still be this intact. let alone still have that distinctive metallic odor. After we had passed the outer ring of ruins, we came up to the bottom of a ridge. According to the satellite photos, this was the last crest before the bunker compound itself came into view. Royce threw up his fist to signal us to stop. Then he opened his hand and dropped it to his side, holding his hand flat, letting us know to go prone and begin crawling up the ridge. As we crawled up the ridge, the cool sand pressed against our bodies, contrasting with the hot air above. We moved slowly and carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. The ridge was steep, and it took effort to keep from sliding back down. When we reached the top, we lay there, peering over the edge. The bunker compound was now in sight. It was surrounded by high fences and watchtowers, with guards patrolling the area. The place looked heavily fortified, just like the satellite images had shown. Royce signaled for us to spread out and observe the area. We needed to find the best way to infiltrate the bunker without being detected. Each of us took a position using binoculars to scan the compound. I focused on a section of the fence where the barbed wire looked old and rusty. It seemed like a weak point we could exploit. I signaled to Royce, pointing out the spot. He nodded in acknowledgement. Royce then motioned for us to gather around him. "All right, here's the plan," he whispered. "We'll approach the fence at that weak point Dex spotted. Once we're through, we split into two teams. Team A will secure the perimeter, while Team B heads straight for the bunker entrance. Remember, we need to move fast and stay quiet." We all nodded in agreement. Royce's plan was solid, and we trusted his judgment. We descended the ridge and made our way to the weak point in the fence. The area was dimly lit by the moon, casting long shadows across the sand. We moved stealthily, keeping low to avoid detection. When we reached the fence, Lee used a pair of wire cutters to create an opening. We slipped through one by one, staying alert for any signs of the enemy. Once inside the compound, we split into two teams as planned. Team A, led by Royce, took positions around the perimeter, ready to engage any guards who might come our way. Team B, consisting of myself, Harris and Lang, headed towards the bunker entrance. As we approached the entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to shift and move as if hiding something just out of sight, but we pressed on, determined to complete our mission. Lang took the lead, using his skills to disable the electronic lock on the bunker door. With a soft click, the door swung open, and we slipped inside. The interior of the bunker was dimly lit and filled with the hum of machinery. The air was cool and stale, a stark contrast to the desert outside. We moved cautiously, staying close to the walls and avoiding the pools of light cast by overhead lamps. We reached a large storage room filled with barrels and canisters marked with warning symbols. "These must be the chemical weapons," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Harris nodded. "Let's rig them with explosives and set the charges. We need to be quick and efficient." We worked swiftly, planting C4 charges on the barrels and canisters. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the sound of our movements. Once the charges were set, we moved on to the next objective. As we navigated the winding corridors, we finally reached the command center. The room was filled with maps, documents, and communication equipment, and there, in the center, stood General Amir Solomon, surrounded by a small group of guards. "Take them out quietly," Harris ordered. We spread out, taking positions around the room. In a synchronized move, we fired our silenced weapons, dropping the guards before they could react. General Solomon, realizing he was cornered, reached for a weapon, but it was too late. Harris's shot hit him squarely in the chest, and he fell to the ground. "Gather all the intelligence you can find," Harris instructed. We quickly collected documents, maps, and anything that looked important. Once we had everything, we made our way back through the bunker to the exit. As we reached the entrance, Harris radioed in the code word, "Archangel." The chopper was on its way. We hurried back to the extraction point, constantly looking over our shoulders. The sense of being watched never left us, but we kept moving. The helicopter's rotor blades were a welcome sound as we reached the LZ. We climbed aboard, the weight of our mission finally lifting as the chopper took off. As we flew back to base, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had haunted me throughout the mission. But we had succeeded. We had destroyed the chemical weapons and eliminated a key figure in the enemy's plans. For now, that was enough. We moved in a zigzag pattern through the ancient ruins. As we walked, I noticed that many of the walls were covered with old writings that weren't in modern Arabic. They probably dated back to the time when these buildings were first constructed. The ink they used was a deep red, like scarlet, and had aged for hundreds of years. I passed close to one of the particularly tall walls that was still standing. As I did, I noticed that the writing on the wall had a faint coppery smell. Could it be? I thought to myself. Back in those days, it wasn't uncommon for people to use animal blood as a form of spiritual protection. For example, the Book of Exodus mentions it. If it were blood, it would be centuries old. There's no way it would still be this intact, let alone have that distinctive metallic odor. We continued on and eventually passed through the outer ring of ruins. Ahead, we saw the bottom of a ridge. According to the satellite photos, this ridge was the last crest before we could see the bunker compound. Royce signaled for us to hold up by throwing up his fist. Then he opened his hand and lowered it to his side, holding his hand flat, indicating that we should go prone and start crawling up the ridge. The ridge was steep and covered in loose sand and rocks. We moved slowly, our bodies pressed against the ground. The coolness of the sand was in stark contrast to the hot air above. As we crawled, we could hear the distant sounds of the desert, the wind blowing and the occasional rustle of wildlife. Reaching the top of the ridge, we lay flat and peered over the edge. The bunker compound came into view. It was heavily fortified, with high fences and watchtowers. Guards were patrolling the area, their figures silhouetted against the dim lights of the compound. Royce signaled for us to spread out and observe the area. We needed to find the best way to infiltrate the bunker without being detected. Each of us took a position, using binoculars to scan the compound for weak points and potential entry routes. The moonlight provided just enough illumination for us to see without being seen. The shadows cast by the moon made the guards' movements seem almost ghostly. We stayed silent, our breaths shallow as we took in every detail of the scene before us. Royce glanced at each of us, ensuring we were ready. We knew that every second counted and that one wrong move could mean disaster. With our hearts pounding, we prepared for the next phase of our mission. My laptop battery is getting low, and I don't trust staying in one place too long while trying to write this story. You never know who might be looking over your shoulder. I'll be back soon to continue, unless of course I end up with a head full of lead. Story 3. The class was buzzing with excitement as everyone suggested ideas for the school festival. There were all kinds of suggestions like bake sales, talent shows, haunted houses, and other fun activities. Eventually, we decided to put on a play. However, most of the plays that the other students had in mind were ones that had been done too many times before, like Romeo and Juliet or The Wizard of Oz. Mrs. Maylene, who was always a bit quirky, said the play we would put on had to be something interesting and unique, something that hadn't been done before. I wasn't very interested in finding a play. In fact, I probably wasn't going to participate at all. The idea of performing in front of an audience of 100 or more terrified me. I don't know why she won't just let us do Shakespeare, Sarah said, leaning against the side of the table and looking up at me. They're classics for a reason, aren't they? She's such a hippie. Don't be mean, I whispered, looking around to make sure Mrs. Maylene wasn't nearby. Besides, I think it would be nice to do something more unique. It makes us stand out more. You know, who knows how many other classes are doing Hamlet? Sure, she began, and a familiar grin spread across her lips. But if we did do Romeo and Juliet, who's to say you can't be Juliet, and a certain someone else can be your Romeo? My cheeks turned red, and I glanced at John, who happened to look up from his book at that exact moment. We locked eyes for a second, but I quickly looked away, staring down at the book in my hands. What do you mean? I asked, trying to play dumb. Wow, real subtle. I didn't even have to say a name. You really do have it bad for him. I didn't say anything in response. I just stared at the pages without reading any of the words. Sarah was right as usual, and I was terrible at hiding it. After school ended and Mom picked me up, I mentioned the play in passing, causing her head to perk up. Her eyes searched the road for a lost memory, and then her face brightened. Well, your grandpa was big into theatre back in his day. He kept a lot of his stuff in the attic. Maybe you can find something there that can give you ideas. It wasn't a bad idea, aside from the fact that cobwebs probably covered most of the room. So, after I got back and ate dinner, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the attic. When I opened the door, a cloud of dust hit my face, filling my nostrils and making me sneeze. It unnerved me. That wasn't saying much, of course. Even a frog croaking could scare me, but the moment I took a step inside, I had never felt more alone. There wasn't a single living thing in there, and the alternative of bugs or spiders using the space as a nest now seemed more favorable. The attic was filled with all sorts of junk, from old furniture and broken appliances to boxes and boxes of useless stuff. Occasionally, I found a fun trinket that distracted me from the creeping sense of isolation, but even that grew tiresome. The search quickly became tedious, but just as I turned around to head back, my foot banged against a box, and pain shot through my poor pinky toe. I stumbled back, landing hard on the ground. That wasn't the only thing that fell. From the box spilled a wide assortment of items, eerie masks depicting countless emotions, cloaks in all sorts of murky colors, and unidentifiable props. Beneath all that was a booklet with yellowed paper, faded ink, and binding so weak I worried that the slightest movement would tear it apart. The cover read, "Ashes of Yttre," and a strange spiral symbol adorned the front. As I followed the streak of black, watching it become smaller and smaller, my mind ached, forcing me to look away. The spiral hung above a simple drawing of a town, almost like a sun. Ashes of Yttre was a tragedy about a town named Yttre and its destruction. A man named Callum encounters a strange, cloaked figure who introduces himself as the Herald. The Herald taunts Callum with the fate of the town, claiming it will crumble no matter what he tries. Callum, undeterred by the Herald's warning, attempts to warn the town. However, the townsfolk, gripped by fear and paranoia, accuse him of being the harbinger of their doom. In their desperation, they bind him to a stake and set him on fire. Callum's lover, a woman named Evelyn, arrives too late. As she mourns his death, the Herald arrives with a solution to her lover's plight, a ritual capable of bringing the dead back to life. What she wasn't told was that the ritual required countless sacrifices in return. The town's residents are all wiped out. Though Callum does return, it is only for a few moments, as his body cannot stay together in this state. He collapses to dust, leaving Evelyn with nothing. It was surprisingly engaging, and I didn't even realize an hour had passed until my mom called out for me. When I brought the dusty booklet to school the next day and placed it on my desk, Sarah immediately snatched it with wide eyes. Intrigue painted her features as she turned it in her hands. "Whoa," she finally said, looking at me with a grin. "I didn't think you of all people would have an occult phase, but here we are." "Hey, it's not mine. I think it belonged to my grandpa. I found it in the attic." I grabbed the edge, trying to slide it back onto my desk, but Sarah wouldn't let go, her eyes tracing the spiral on the cover. Can I please have it back?" "Hey guys!" Sarah snatched it away from me, raising it into the air and waving it back and forth. "Check out what Penny found." The other students perked up and made their way over to us. My eyes went wide as they stared at me. It's not... What is it?" Max's voice cut through the chatter as he pushed his way to the front. He was taller than most of the class, so the crowd parted for him easily, and Sarah could do nothing as he took it from her. His usual smirk was firmly in place, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes as he looked at the booklet. "It doesn't have the author or the name of the publisher or anything." "A playwright, actually," John corrected, motioning for Max to pass him the book. Max rolled his eyes and tossed the script to John, who caught it without much difficulty. "Ashes of Yttre," he read aloud, sitting in the empty seat beside me. He flipped through the pages, skimming over the words. Each time he reacted, Sarah would peer over and ask what was happening, and John would summarize the scene. "They burn him alive. That's dark. Why would anyone write that?" Sarah grimaced. "I mean, old plays are always like that. Death, betrayal, tragedy, yada yada." Max brushed it off. "What makes it so special?" "I don't know, it just is," John murmured. "The writing's good though, like really good. It feels real." "Let me see," Sarah said, practically bouncing on her toes. "Come on, read it to us. We'll figure out if it's worth doing." John glanced at me, hesitation flickering in his eyes. "You're okay with this, right?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Sarah just shoved the book in his face. "Just read it already, Romeo," she whined. He sighed and cleared his throat. "Scene 1, Act 1, he began. The room went quiet as he started to read, his voice low and steady. Just like that, the chatter and laughter evaporated. Every face in the room turned toward him, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. John didn't stutter once while reading, as if he'd memorized it by heart. It was mesmerizing. When he finished the closing lines of Act 1, an eerie silence followed. For a moment, no one moved, their eyes fixed on him as if he were still speaking. Mrs. Maylene, who was standing in the corner, broke the spell with an enthusiastic clap. "It's settled then. Ashes of Yetri is our class play," she declared. "Does that work for everybody? We've got a winner, yeah?" Everyone cheered and clapped. The decision was unanimous. Sarah grinned, her eyes glinting with mischief. "I think we can all agree that the main character should be played by the person who brought the script," she said, and everyone nodded their heads, their gazes fixated on me. My heart leapt to my throat, and a sudden wave of nausea overcame me. "What? No way." I shook my head frantically. "I can't. I can barely act, and I'd freeze up the moment I went on stage. I can't." "You can't run from the spotlight forever, Penny," Sarah grinned. "Plus, I think you're just being modest. I'm sure you'll be great." "Right, guys." She looked around, and they all voiced their agreement. John was the last to speak, and he hesitated for a moment. "It'd be pretty cool to see you up there. You're the one who found the script, after all. You should get the honor." His words were like honey to my ears, and my resolve weakened. He looked at me and gave me a smile. That was the tipping point. "Okay," I muttered, looking down at the paper. "Oh, so him you listen to," Max finally chimed in. "Since the ball is already rolling, why doesn't John play the male lead?" "Well, he is dead for 50% of the play, so it's not like I have to do much," John murmured, genuinely considering it. The class erupted into discussions, deciding who would be who, what the set would look like, and where we would find props and costumes. It was a relief that everyone was happy with what I brought, but their enthusiasm was intimidating. In the end, it was decided that I would play Evie Lane, John would play Callum, and Max would play the Herald, a role he got completely because of his height. "So, should we transcribe the play and print it for everyone?" a student asked. Mrs. Maylene's expression grew stern. "No, we can't just copy it. You'll have to memorize it from the source," she said firmly, tapping the booklet. The class exchanged looks, but no one protested. After a moment, she cleared her throat and clasped her hands together. "That's enough excitement for today. Get to your seats. Class is starting." Sarah sat in the seat in front of me and turned to face me. She was still grinning, and I wondered how her cheeks didn't hurt. "Well, Evie Lane," she said with a laugh. "Are you excited?" "Don't call me that," I groaned. "Oh, come on, it's just for practice." She stuck her tongue out, and I tried not to giggle. "How would you feel if I started calling you Elsha then?" Sarah shrugged. "Better than my real name." Before I could respond, she turned back around. After school, I decided to copy the play, even though Mrs. Maylene said not to. The original was hard to read because of the weird font and yellow paper, so the next day I made copies and handed them out. "You're not supposed to have copies," Max said as he looked through the pages. I looked down at the floor. I know, but the original is hard to read. It's not much different anyway." He gave the copy back to me with a shrug. "Sorry, but you heard Mrs. Maylene. We have to use the original. It's more authentic." I wanted to argue, but decided not to. Every other student reacted the same way, and they all returned my copies. As I went back to my seat, Mrs. Maylene took all the copies from me and threw them in the recycling bin. "Since you can't be trusted with the original, I'll be taking it from now on," she said. I didn't fight back and let her take the script. She looked at the spiral and smiled softly. "Now, shall we begin? Shall we?" The progress was surprisingly smooth. The actors fell into their roles quickly, even though they hadn't memorized all their lines. We still had a couple of weeks until the festival. I, however, was falling behind. This was strange since I was the only one with a copy and could practice at home. Sarah assured me that I would get it in no time. "We have 2 weeks. Don't worry so much," she told me whenever I mentioned it. She fit into her role effortlessly. It was like she was made to play a mob leader, with the way she incited the audience and screamed her lines with a crazed look in her eye. She would laugh maniacally, but no one questioned if she was enjoying herself too much. She got so into her role that when I praised her after rehearsals, a look of disgust appeared on her face. But then she blinked, and it was gone, replaced by her usual grin. "Thanks. I didn't expect acting could be so fun. Usually with these school plays I'd get bored after like a week," she said, her smile stretching a bit too much. "But with this, it's just different." "It is." "Yeah, it's like a high," she admitted. "When I'm on stage, it's like nothing else matters. It's just me and the audience. Nothing can touch us. I love it." Her eyes lit up, and I couldn't help but smile. It was nice seeing her enjoy herself so much. That smile disappeared, however, after what she said next. Realizing she was late for volleyball practice, Sarah hurried away. "Oops, gotta go. Bye, Evelyn." This time it didn't seem like a joke. My fears were confirmed in the following days, not just by Sarah, but by the entire class. Their dedication was intense. They poured themselves into practicing their roles and reciting the lines. At first it was funny seeing everyone so invested, but as it consumed more and more of their lives, I found it harder to laugh. Max's changes were especially noticeable. He usually cracked jokes and was the loudest in the room, but since then, he'd become oddly quiet. It wasn't until rehearsals that I realized how bad it had gotten. He stepped across the stage, reciting the herald's lines with terrifying intensity. He must not have seen where he was going because he walked straight into a wall. A sickening crunch echoed through the auditorium. "Max!" I rushed to his side, watching blood trail down his lips and land on his shoes. "Max, are you all right?" He just looked at me with unfocused eyes. It was like he didn't notice, his lips mouthing words I could barely hear. "The herald waits where the black sun gleams, beyond the veil and behind the seams. The stars will weep at the break of day in the ashes of Ytre." "Max, snap out of it." He shook his head, eyes widening before that trademark grin appeared on his lips. "Was that convincing enough for you?" He pinched his nose to stop the bleeding before jogging back to his mark, desperately trying to play it off. My stomach churned, watching as everyone else brushed it off without a second glance. Most of the reactions were directed at me, as if I was the one overreacting. Mrs. Maylene clapped her hands, calling for everyone to reset their positions, and the rest of the rehearsal carried on like usual. I tried to tell myself it didn't bother me, but the alienation was getting to me. Even Sarah, who used to be my partner in crime for complaining about school projects, was too wrapped up in her role to care about anything else. She hadn't talked to me in days. Feeling more alone than ever, I hesitated by the cafeteria doors, scanning the room. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, but John sat at his usual table, his nose buried in the script. Max sat across from him, but he quickly got up and left, his eyes staring far beyond anything in front of him. John, though dedicated, had always seemed more grounded than the others. Maybe I was imagining things, but he didn't look so far gone. I swallowed my nerves and made my way over, sliding into the seat next to his. "Hey, John, how's the history assignment going for you?" He looked up at me and blinked a couple of times. "History assignment?" "Yeah, the one we got last week. It's due in a couple of days." It wasn't like him to forget, but that was far from the strangest thing happening. His face darkened, and he shook his head. "Oh, I guess I forgot about it. There are more important things to worry about," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "What, the play?" I poked at the food on my plate, grimacing at the unappetizing texture. Why is everyone so obsessed with some mediocre script? His fist slammed on the table, making my tray jump. My heart raced as I looked up at him, his eyes burning with something I couldn't quite place. His teeth clenched, and his knuckles were white against the table. "It's not mediocre," he finally said. "It's not. You don't understand." I'm sorry," I stammered. "I just don't get what's happening. Why is everyone so fixated on it? Sarah's been acting as crazy as her character. Max is rarely ever lucid anymore, and now you—" I gestured toward him, my voice breaking. "Now you're snapping at me over a stupid play. What's wrong with you? You've never been like this before." "Because it is our life," John growled. His face softened, and he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know why you just can't see it. It's not just words on a page, Evelyn, it's—" "Penny." I stood, taking my tray with me. "My name is Penny." He tried to protest, but I turned on my heel and left the cafeteria. As soon as I was out of his sight, I dropped my tray in the garbage and headed outside, trying not to let the tears fall. I just wanted it to be over with. The day of the festival arrived, and the school was buzzing with activity. The smell of sweets and popcorn filled the hallways. Students and parents walked past us, chatting happily. I, unfortunately, couldn't enjoy any of it. because I was busy with last-minute preparations for our performance. The atmosphere felt heavy, and silence hung in the air. There was tension in the classroom, though none of the students seemed to notice. My heart pounded in my chest, and it took all I had not to panic. Just then, I felt someone bump into me. It was Sarah, wearing a simple blue dress and a cloak. Oh, Sarah, hey!" She shot me a look over her shoulder before walking away. John just patted my shoulder with an awkward grin. "You can do this," he muttered, though it seemed more for his benefit than mine. "All right, the play's starting soon," Mrs. Maylene announced with a wide grin. "I checked the auditorium, and it looks like it's a full house. Break a leg, everyone." Students got into position. The curtains opened, revealing a darkened stage. A spotlight shone on John as he began his monologue. All eyes were on him, and he delivered his lines as if they were second nature. His words were filled with conviction and emotion, and the audience loved it. I couldn't blame them. It was mesmerizing. Then it was my turn, and I shuffled on stage. Ignoring the countless pairs of eyes watching me, I forced myself to recite my lines. The first scene went smoothly, then the second, the third, and the fourth. By the end of Act 1, it was clear. I had done great. We'd all done great. Backstage, I saw Sarah giving me a big grin and a thumbs up. The hateful expression was no longer in her eyes. As the curtains closed, the audience's applause was thunderous. A sense of relief and pride washed over me. I looked around and saw everyone smiling and congratulating each other. Even Mrs. Maylene had a proud look on her face. "You all did amazing," she said, clapping her hands together. "Now, let's get ready for Act 2. We quickly got back into position. As the curtains opened again, the energy backstage was electric. Everyone was in their roles, and the performance was flawless. Sarah's portrayal of the mob leader was as intense as ever, and John's monologue left the audience in awe. When the final scene ended and the curtains closed for the last time, the applause was even louder than before. We all took our bows, and the audience stood up, clapping and cheering. It was a moment of pure joy. Backstage, Sarah hugged me tightly. "We did it, Evelaine," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "We really did it." I smiled back at her, feeling the same excitement. Yeah, we did, and it was worth all the hard work. As we walked out to join the rest of the festival, I realized that despite all the stress and tension, we had achieved something incredible together. It was a performance none of us would ever forget. Luckily, Evelaine didn't appear at all for the rest of Act 2, so I could take a break. I watched as Max, wearing a cloak and a mask that covered half his face, spoke his lines easily. Even though he didn't like acting, he was really good at it. His loud voice echoed through the auditorium, and it felt like the whole stage shook when he walked. Sarah was also doing great, and her eyes were filled with a wild energy that made me shiver as she got everyone excited. "Now, we march," Sarah shouted. "March to Ytre. March for our town! For our lives." The curtains closed again. It was almost the end now, and I had my most difficult scene coming up. But first, it was Callum's death scene. The mob struggled with him, and even though John tried to fight back, it didn't work. His body was dragged onto a wooden plank, and the crowd cheered. Sarah held up a lit torch with a crazy grin, then threw it at the base of the cross. I was curious to see how they would create the fire effect, but as the orange flames climbed up the stake, I realized it was real smoke. There were no special effects. John screamed. The flames grew bigger and hotter, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. It wasn't fake. The fire was real, and John was really burning. The audience watched in a mix of horror and amazement. To them, it was all part of the act, but hearing them clap for his performance made me feel sick. The mob left the stage, and it was my turn to go on. My steps were shaky and stiff. Tears filled my eyes. The charred body hissed and steamed. John was unrecognizable. No, I whispered. "Callum." I meant to say John, but my tongue slipped, and I said Callum instead. Slow, steady footsteps came from behind, and a tall figure stepped into the light. I turned around, expecting to see Max, but it wasn't him. The man's shadow stretched over the stage, and the light flickered as if it couldn't fully reveal him. The cloak covering his body seemed to move on its own, and the smiling mask he wore seemed to blink and breathe. "Hello, Evelaine." The voice that greeted me was a low, eerie growl, like a parrot imitating a human's voice. I didn't want to respond. I didn't want to move, breathe, or even exist in his presence. Every part of me wanted to run away, to disappear into the shadows, but that choice wasn't mine anymore. Who are you? A wanderer, a scholar, a performer, an observer, the man listed, counting each title on his long, slender fingers. But more importantly, I bring gifts. He stretched out his arm and showed me his pale, smooth hand. Fingers with claw-like nails opened up, revealing his palm. A symbol was carved into his skin, a jagged, uneven spiral, dripping blood and pus. Draw this on your dear Callum's body, and the ritual will begin. He will live again. Isn't that what you want, Evie Lane? No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break eye contact. It was as if his dark, empty eyes were holding mine captive. I had felt a slight pull before, a small, nagging whisper that I might have ignored if I tried hard enough. But now, with the stage set and his presence looming over me, that whisper had turned into a loud, relentless roar. It was too late to turn back. He was here, and there was no escaping him. "Yes," I said, the words feeling strange. His hand disappeared into his cloak, and he turned with unnatural precision, vanishing into the darkness. Once he was gone, I dug my nails into the palm of my hand, blood seeping through the wound. With shaking fingers, I traced the symbol on John's burnt flesh. For a moment, the world held its breath. Not a sound filled the air, not from the actors nor the audience. Then, a scream shattered the silence, high and piercing, followed by a guttural choking that made my stomach drop. An actor, playing a villager, fell to their knees and clutched their head, screaming in pain. Soon, every actor was screaming and convulsing. Blood poured from their eyes in thick streams. The red liquid swirled in the air like snakes, then rushed into the symbol I had drawn. The spiral began to glow, casting an eerie yellow light over the room. The stage lights flickered, swaying back and forth. I felt my skin burn from the intense heat, and each breath felt like inhaling ash. Sarah's face twisted in pain as she clutched her throat. She writhed on the ground for a moment before looking at me, a familiar look on her face. I wanted to scream her name, but it felt like my lungs were filled with cement. She mouthed something to me before her eyes rolled back, joining the rest of the actors. The audience's applause faltered, replaced by confusion and fear as screams began to rise. I watched in horror as random members of the audience writhed in the same way, their blood draining from them. Those who weren't affected cried and screamed, running for the exits. It was chaos. Soon the suspended bodies fell to the ground. The stage lights flickered back on. John's body twitched, and a sickening crunch drew my attention back to him. Skin began to form, grafted onto the body with little care. Muscles, bones, organs, all of them were stitched back together. Most disturbingly, I started to recognize John. Though incomplete, his features, the ones I had come to know and love, were starting to form. He opened his eyes, locking his gaze with mine. In those dark, bottomless eyes, I saw my own tear-stained face reflected back at me. His body was barely holding together, and the recreation left him disfigured. He smiled anyway, and that soft expression broke through my shock. I wrapped my arms around him, apologizing over and over. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." My words were choked by sobs. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't brought the play, none of this would have happened. It's all my—" He hushed me. "The play must go on," he murmured. "We're not done yet." I swallowed hard and nodded. A kiss. That was how the play ended. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands, and leaned in. As our lips touched, his body turned to ash, collapsing into me like a burnt-out ember. His ashes clung to my skin, cold and lifeless. In the suffocating silence that followed, a single sound rose, a slow, deliberate clap. The hollow echo of Mrs. Maylene's applause filled the room. I turned to her as the curtains closed, the manic grin on her face the last thing I saw. The rest of the class joined her, clapping with the same intensity. "Bravo!" she cheered, her grin widening. "Absolutely phenomenal, especially you. Penny!" Then darkness overtook me. When I woke up, the police had stormed the building, and Mrs. Maylene was in custody. They called it a mass indoctrination that led to mass suicide, but I knew better. Everyone who was there did. Those of us who survived were taken to the hospital. An officer kept asking me questions, each one more insistent than the last. I told them everything. They didn't believe me, but they thanked me for my cooperation. "One last thing, if you don't mind. the officer asked. "We've accounted for all but 2 missing students." "I already told you John is gone," I murmured, the words catching in my throat. Yes, but, well, there's someone else who hasn't been accounted for," he said, looking through his notes. "A boy named Max Haddock." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt my lungs failing me, shallow breaths escaping my lips. That indescribable pressure returned, the weight that had crushed me when the herald stood before me. "Miss?" The officer's voice was distant, fading in the background as I slowly turned to face the windows. Beneath a lamppost that shone a sickly yellow light, a figure stood. Tall, cloaked, watching.